The silence after the engine cough wasn't mechanical failure. It was the sound of a 7-year-old lie shattering thousands of feet above solid ground. My husband recognized the pilot's voice instantly, and in that single second, I knew the past we ran from had finally caught up to us mid-flight. The air in the cabin was thick, not with the usual recycled breath of pressurized aluminum, but with something sharper, metallic, and undeniably wrong. I remember the initial shudder, a deep, rattling cough from the twin engines of our regional jet somewhere over the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Canadian Shield. We were flying from Vancouver to Toronto, a routine mid-afternoon hop, and I was pretending to work on my laptop, mentally drafting an email about quarterly projections. My name is Clara. For the last 7 years, my name has been Clara Vance. Before that, it was something else, something whispered only in the dark corners of my memory, a name connected to a past my husband David had paid an unimaginable price to escape. He was in witness protection, relocated halfway across the continent under a new identity, starting fresh after he testified against a very powerful, very vengeful organized scheme. We lived quietly, too quietly perhaps. When the first alarm blared, a synthetic, hysterical shriek over the intercom, my focus snapped instantly. David, sitting beside me, clutching the armrest so hard his knuckles were white, didn't even flinch outwardly. But I saw the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't the concerned passenger. He was the man who knew exactly what structural failure sounded like versus what sounded like an incident. "Cabin crew to the flight deck, immediately," crackled the pilot's voice, tight and professionally strained. David leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. "This isn't turbulence, Clara. Listen to the frequency of the vibration." I listened. It wasn't the random bouncing of weather. It was rhythmic, mechanical fatigue playing out in slow motion. A sinking sensation took hold, deeper than anything gravity could inflict. The flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, her smile frozen in terror, finally appeared. She forced a calm that didn't reach her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some minor technical difficulties. The cockpit crew is handling the situation. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts securely." Minor technical difficulties. Right. As if the sudden, sickening drop we just experienced was equivalent to a loose overhead bin. David nudged me, pointing subtly toward the cockpit door, which was slightly ajar due to the flight crew being summoned. He caught my eye, a flicker of communication passing between us that spanned 7 years of shared deception and forced normalcy. "Stay calm. Don't draw attention." The plane listed hard to the left. Outside the window, the blue sky was giving way to an angry, bruised gray mass of cloud cover, and the wing looked terrifyingly close to the churning atmosphere. Then, the secondary announcement came, not from the usual captain, but from someone else, a voice that cut through the cabin's rising panic like an ice pick. "This is your captain speaking. We have lost primary hydraulic control. We are diverting immediately to the nearest suitable airfield. Stay calm. I repeat, stay calm." The voice. It was deep, resonant, but there was a timbre to it, an almost imperceptible hitch on certain consonants that slammed into my consciousness like a physical blow. It was impossible. It couldn't be. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying the altitude sickness or stress was making me hallucinate the acoustics. But when the pilot called for the flight attendants again, repeating the request with a tone of absolute urgency, I knew. I knew that voice. It was the voice of the man David betrayed, the man who was supposed to be cooling his heels in a federal penitentiary for the next 3 decades, the man whose testimony put 6 high-ranking members of the network away, the man whose survival depended entirely on the fact that David's new identity remained secure. I looked at David. His face had gone from pale to the color of old parchment. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring, fixedly, at the cockpit door, recognizing the cadence, the shadow of authority in that forced calm. "David," I whispered, my throat tight. That's Marcus. Marcus Thorne, the former lieutenant, the man who walked away from the deal, claiming David had fabricated crucial evidence to save his own skin. He was supposed to be incarcerated, awaiting trial on charges that would guarantee him a massive sentence. David finally turned to me, his eyes wide, no longer calculating, just filled with pure, distilled dread. He shouldn't be flying. He shouldn't even be out of protective custody. He was supposed to be in a maximum security facility. The plane lurched again, this time much more violently, sending unsecured items skittering down the aisle. We were descending too fast, shaking apart mid-air. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. If Marcus was flying this plane, it meant one of two catastrophic things. Either he had engineered an elaborate, terrifying escape and somehow commandeered an aircraft mid-flight, a scenario almost too cinematic to be real, or, far worse, he had been working within the system. He must have cut a deal, I breathed, trying to rationalize the impossible. He got immunity for something else, and now he's free. David shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the door. No. Immunity wouldn't get him a pilot's license and put him in command of an airliner, Clara. Not in a week, not in a year. Then, the realization hit me with the force of an emergency braking system deploying prematurely. If Marcus was free, and he was flying the plane we were currently in, then he hadn't just escaped custody. He had bypassed every security protocol imaginable. He hadn't just cut a deal. He had leverage. Leverage that could only come from knowing secrets that someone powerful wanted buried. And what secret did Marcus know better than anyone else? The true identity of David Vance. Before I could even voice the terror coiling in my stomach, the cockpit door swung fully open. Marcus Thorne stood framed in the doorway. He wasn't wearing a pilot's uniform. He was in street clothes, a dark, expensive-looking jacket, and his face, etched with lines I didn't remember from the grainy surveillance photos David occasionally showed me, was set in a predatory grin. He didn't look panicked about the failing hydraulics. He looked triumphant. He scanned the cabin, his eyes locking onto David with terrifying precision. "Well, well," Marcus boomed, his voice carrying effortlessly over the engine whine and the terrified murmurs of the passengers. He stepped out into the aisle, ignoring the terrified flight attendants pressed against the galley wall. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew the situation was entirely under his control, despite the plane rattling around him. He didn't address the cabin. He pointed a finger, steady and unwavering, directly at my husband. "David Miller," Marcus said, savoring the forbidden name. "Funny seeing you here. I was just on my way to have a very serious discussion about loose ends." The name David Miller hung in the pressurized air, a declaration of war. Around us, the other passengers, the executives, the tourists, the families, were finally piecing together that this wasn't just a mechanical issue. This was personal, centered directly on the couple in 14A. Murmurs turned to sharp gasps. A businessman 2 rows up started fumbling for his phone, his hand shaking too much to unlock the screen. David didn't move. He couldn't. He was locked in a silent confrontation with the ghost of his past, the man who held the key to our present annihilation. Marcus Thorne, standing there, radiating dark authority, had just pulled the pin on the grenade that was our witness protection existence. "Marcus," David managed, his voice rough, betraying the carefully constructed facade of calm he maintained for 7 years. "What in God's name are you doing here? You're supposed to be serving time." Marcus laughed, a short, harsh bark devoid of humor. He took a step closer, completely ignoring the frantic signaling from the flight attendants, who were now trying to form a human barrier between him and the cockpit, which he had clearly vacated for this impromptu announcement. "Serving time?" Marcus scoffed, tilting his head. "Oh, David, you always misunderstood the game. You thought testifying bought you clean slate. You thought the government truly cared about dismantling the operation. You were a useful tool, yes, but I was the insurance policy." He paused, letting the implications of that sink in, not just for us, but for the dozen innocent people suddenly trapped in the crossfire of our shared violent history. "You think they let me go because I sang? No. I traded names. I traded locations, and the most valuable piece of currency I had was the confirmation of your location, your real location, Clara Vance's old life, and the trajectory of your new existence. My blood turned to ice water. He wasn't just here to gloat. He was here as an assassin, or worse, an executioner sent by the people who thought David's testimony was incomplete or inconvenient. The organized scheme hadn't been dismantled. It had simply regrouped, finding leverage higher up the chain than we ever suspected. "You don't have the authority to be here," David ground out, forcing himself to stand up, positioning his body slightly in front of mine. It was a futile gesture, a reflex of the man he used to be, the protector, the fighter, against the reality of the situation. We were thousands of feet in the air, trapped in a falling tin can, steered by our mortal enemy. Marcus merely smiled wider, pulling something from inside his jacket. It wasn't a firearm. That would have been too messy for his purposes, too crude for the statement he was making. It was a sleek, military-grade satellite phone, still active. Authority? Marcus leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dropping just enough so only we could hear the venom beneath the stage whisper. "I don't need the jurisdiction's authority, David. I have the authority of the shareholders, and they were very disappointed in your initial testimony. They felt you conveniently left out a few key facilitators, didn't you? A few names that would have implicated some very high-ranking individuals on the periphery of the Justice Department itself." This was it. The collapse of the entire structure we had been hiding beneath. David hadn't just testified against street thugs. He'd been involved with people connected to powerful, untouchable figures who preferred silence over disclosure. And now, Marcus was here to enforce that silence, mid-flight. "The deal was supposed to hold," David pleaded, his composure finally cracking. "They guaranteed our safety." "They guaranteed your silence," Marcus corrected him smoothly. "And they gave me clearance to clean up the remaining loose thread. You see, David, when you entered witness protection, you didn't just get a new name, you got a tracking beacon, and I just activated it." He tapped the satellite phone. "We aren't landing in Toronto, David. We're landing where my associates are waiting. And trust me, the hospitality there is far less structured than what the U.S. Marshals offered." At that moment, the entire aircraft jolted with brutal force. It wasn't turbulence. It sounded like something had struck the fuselage, a heavy impact, perhaps a piece of debris or, more chillingly, an external contact. The cabin lights flickered violently, dying down to a sickly emergency red glow. The synthetic voice of the flight computer shrieked, "Warning! Structural integrity compromised. Evacuation procedures initiated." Panic erupted. Passengers screamed, the businessman finally dropping his phone. David shoved me hard toward the emergency exit door behind us, his eyes wide with sudden, desperate action. "Go, now!" he yelled, pushing me toward the rear galley even as Marcus lunged for him. Marcus roared in frustration, realizing his prey was trying to escape the confines of the immediate confrontation. He abandoned David for a moment, pivoting toward me, toward the exit. "You think an escape route works at 25,000 feet, Clara?" Marcus snarled, reaching out to grab my shoulder. But David was faster than Marcus anticipated. He tackled Marcus low, not aiming to fight, but to disrupt. They slammed against the narrow aisle wall between the rows of seats. The impact sent Marcus's satellite phone flying. It slid across the carpet and disappeared under a seat near the bulkhead. The plane began a rapid, uncontrolled spiral downward. I scrambled toward the rear door, yanking at the handle, just as David and Marcus separated, both breathing hard, both realizing the gravity of their aerial cage match. "David, we have to brace," I screamed over the rising wind noise outside. Marcus, recovering quickly, looked past me toward the exit door handle I was grappling with. His face contorted into a mask of pure fury, realizing his captive was seconds from attempting a suicidal exit. "Don't you dare open that door," Marcus shrieked, moving toward me again. "You'll depressurize the whole cabin." But David was already there, between Marcus and me. He slammed his palm against the emergency release, throwing his entire weight against the mechanism, just as Marcus reached him. The door handle clicked, the pressure seal began to hiss, and the sound of rushing, freezing air drowned out everything else. I looked back one last time. David was wrestling Marcus, using the confined space to his advantage. But Marcus had an edge, a heavy, metallic glint in his hand. He had retrieved something from his jacket lining, and as the cabin pressure began to drop violently, sucking loose items toward the expanding gap where the door was beginning to buckle outward, I saw Marcus press that object against David's side, right beneath his ribs. A dull, sickening thud echoed over the screaming wind, a sound that wasn't hydraulic failure or structural stress, but something far more final. David's eyes widened, not in rage, but in a sudden, sharp understanding of betrayal. And then, nothing. He slumped against the opening, an obstacle now, not a fighter. The emergency door ripped outward with a deafening roar, not fully detaching, but jamming halfway open, creating a savage, wind-tunneling vortex of minus 40-degree air and shredded insulation, directly aimed at the man who just saved my life by dying in front of me. And I was standing directly in the path of the outflow. The scream of the atmosphere trying to equalize was a physical thing, tearing at my clothes, pulling at my very skin. I felt the vacuum attempt to peel me away from the floor, gravity suddenly seeming irrelevant compared to the terrifying suction of the open airlock. David's body, heavy and suddenly limp, was wedged partially in the gap, acting as a makeshift plug against the worst of the gale. Marcus Thorne was thrown violently backward, crashing into the row of seats opposite, his dark jacket flapping uselessly against the stream of air rushing toward the opening. He was momentarily stunned, struggling to right himself against the brutal, invisible current. My training, the deeply buried reflexive knowledge from my other life, kicked in, overriding the shock and the grief that was already a white-hot spike in my chest. Containment, stabilization. If the door failed completely, everyone aboard would be sucked out or freeze instantly. I reached for the secondary manual lock, the emergency override handle that was only supposed to be used by crew in the direst situations, designed to force the door shut against pressure differentials if the primary mechanisms failed. My fingers, numb within seconds, scraped against the cold metal housing. I didn't look at David. I couldn't afford to look at the metallic glint that Marcus had used against him. David was gone, sacrificed to buy me this sliver of time. I wrenched the override handle down with a desperate grunt, using my entire body weight. The mechanism groaned in protest, metal grinding against metal, but it held. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the fractured door began to slide inward against the impossible pressure gradient. As the door started to close, the vortex lessened slightly, allowing the cabin temperature to creep marginally above absolute zero. The screaming passengers, huddled low, began to stir from their frozen paralysis. Marcus recovered faster than I expected. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the fractured seats, his eyes blazing with murderous intent, directed solely at me. He knew I was the only remaining witness to his betrayal of the protection agreement, the only remaining link to the secrets he sold. "Clara, stop this!" he roared, attempting to wade through the chaos of the aisle, but the debris, overturned carts, personal belongings, and the growing realization of what David had just done, made his progress agonizingly slow. I slammed the manual override shut, engaging the emergency clamp pins. The lock engaged with a final, deafening thunk. Silence rushed in, broken only by the frantic beeping of the remaining warning systems and the gasping, terrified breaths of the passengers. The cabin was dim, red emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows, but the air was still breathable, though thin and frigid. I turned slowly, bracing myself for Marcus. But he wasn't moving toward me. He was staring past me, toward the cockpit entrance, his face draining of color even beneath the harsh red light. "That's not right," Marcus muttered, sounding genuinely confused for the first time since he appeared. "The autopilot sequence shouldn't initiate a landing trajectory this steep unless—" The pilot, who had not been Marcus, the original captain, whose identity Marcus had assumed to get onto the flight deck, was slumped over the controls, but his hand, seemingly of its own accord, was twitching. Or perhaps it wasn't his hand. From the co-pilot's seat, a figure slowly began to rise. It wasn't a crew member. It was a woman, dressed in the slightly oversized, ill-fitting flight attendant uniform Marcus had clearly forced one of his initial victims into. Her face was pale, bruised, but her eyes were sharp, focused, and utterly devoid of fear. She had waited. She had been playing dead, or perhaps just playing the part of a terrified hostage, until Marcus had revealed his true intentions and his weapon. She moved with a terrifying economy of motion. She bypassed Marcus entirely, heading straight for the satellite phone that had skittered under the seat when David tackled him. She snatched it up, checking the screen, the one Marcus needed to coordinate his extraction team. "They're not coming for you, Marcus," she said, her voice calm, resonating with authority that dwarfed Marcus's criminal bravado. "The deal is off. You breached protocol. You involved federal assets in a non-sanctioned removal." Marcus stared at her, disbelief warring with sudden, dawning horror. "Who the hell are you?" "You're not part of the network." "I'm the cleanup crew," she replied coolly, looking down at the phone in her hand. "And you just confirmed David Miller was alive and here, making this entire extraction a complete failure." She didn't hesitate. She crushed the satellite phone under the heel of her sensible black pump. The sound of shattering plastic and electronics was immensely satisfying. Marcus lunged for her, recognizing that his only lifeline, his communication with his employers, was gone. But the woman was agile. She sidestepped his charge with practiced ease, placing herself between him and the cockpit, where the captain was still unresponsive. "You think I didn't have a contingency?" she asked Marcus, her voice barely audible over the strained groaning of the descending aircraft. "David Miller was inconvenient, yes, but you, Marcus, you just committed an act of egregious operational failure aboard a commercial flight carrying over 100 witnesses to your attempt at a hostile takeover." She looked directly at me, her expression hardening. "Clara Vance, I'm with the Internal Security Division. We knew Thorne was compromised. We let him board. We knew he'd try to get to David. We needed proof of who was pulling his strings." My mind reeled. David hadn't been betrayed just by Marcus. He had been a sacrificial lamb in a much larger, deeper internal security sting operation. And now I was the collateral damage, or the key witness to their operation. "Where are we going?" I managed to choke out, pointing toward the rapidly approaching, impossibly close, dark terrain filling the forward windows. The woman glanced out, her face grim. "We're not landing conventionally. The hydraulics are shot. But the internal safety measures are still engaged. We're going to attempt a high-speed ditching into the Great Lakes. It's the safest option left." She turned back to Marcus, who was now trapped between the damaged exit door and the rapidly approaching waterline visible through the cockpit window. "And you, Marcus," she said, raising her hand, not with a gun, but with a small, sleek, black device attached to a wrist strap. "You just ended your career, and you ensured David received the highest possible commendation for cooperation before his unavoidable termination." Before Marcus could react, she pressed a button on the device. A high-pitched, almost inaudible whine filled the air, and Marcus Thorne froze mid-stride. He didn't slump like David. He simply locked up, his eyes wide, fixed on the approaching water, unable to move, unable to scream. A perfectly preserved statue of criminal hubris. The woman secured her own harness, checked the restraints on the paralyzed Marcus, and then looked at me, her gaze softening slightly. "Clara, you need to strap yourself into the jump seat, now. We have about 60 seconds until impact. If you survive this, you need to tell my superiors everything Thorne said about the facilitators." I nodded numbly, crawling over the dead weight of my husband, my savior, toward the emergency restraint seat by the galley. I strapped myself in, my hands shaking so violently I could barely clip the buckle. The woman gripped the control yoke, a secondary control panel she had clearly activated, and braced herself. "Hold tight, Vance. This is going to be rough." The plane screamed as it met the black surface of the lake. The impact was not a slow sinking. It was a catastrophic explosion of splintering metal and rushing water. The world dissolved into a chaos of noise, cold, and crushing pressure. I remember the sickening crunch, the total blackout, the agonizing few seconds where my lungs burned for air that wasn't there. Then, mercifully, silence again, followed by the faint, distant sound of gurgling water still pouring in from the wreckage around me. I fought to open my eyes, to move the debris pinning my legs. I was underwater, submerged in freezing blackness, but I could still see one faint, horrifying silhouette through the fractured windshield. The rigid, paralyzed form of Marcus Thorne, still strapped into the pilot's seat, positioned perfectly to witness the sinking of the entire plane. And then a new sound pierced the waterlogged quiet, a rhythmic, heavy thump, thump, thump overhead, growing louder, faster. Not the sound of the plane's failing engines, but the unmistakable, powerful beat of approaching military rotor wash. My internal security contact had delivered her promised extraction team. I kicked upward desperately, swimming toward the faint disturbance of light where the fuselage had buckled. I broke the surface, gasping in the icy night air, expecting to see rescue helicopters. Instead, silhouetted against the moonlit sky was a single, massive, sleek black stealth helicopter hovering silently. It wasn't a rescue vehicle. It wasn't marked with any insignia I recognized, and from its open bay door, dropping silently onto the surface of the water near the wreckage, were not paramedics, but 3 figures in full tactical gear, moving with the terrifying fluid efficiency of highly trained executioners. They weren't coming to save me. They were coming to collect the evidence, and Marcus Thorne was the prize. The tactical figures hit the water with almost no splash, silent, dark shapes dissolving into the inky blackness surrounding the partially submerged wreckage of the airliner. They moved with a predatory grace that spoke volumes. These were not the people who provided witness protection. These were the people who ensured silence afterward. I treaded water frantically, the sub-zero temperature of the lake already leaching the heat from my core, my body screaming in protest. I had to get away from the plane. David was trapped inside, and that woman, my supposed rescuer, was either submerged with the paralyzed Marcus or had already been dealt with by these silent arrivals. I pushed off the sinking fuselage, swimming blindly away from the epicenter of the disaster, fighting the debilitating cold. I glanced back one last time toward the cockpit area, the place where I last saw David alive. The internal emergency lights inside the cabin were dying, sputtering as water crept higher into the fuselage. I could just make out the dark outline of Marcus Thorne, frozen in his seat, a macabre trophy suspended in the wreckage. Then, one of the figures broke away from the search pattern near the tail section. It wasn't swimming. It was moving with uncanny speed across the water's surface. They were wearing some kind of specialized propulsion device, a silent, high-tech glide suit. This individual was heading directly toward me. I tried to swim harder, but the exhaustion was immediate and crippling. The cold had locked my muscles. My vision began to tunnel, the edges blurring into gray static. This was how it ended, not in a clean courtroom revelation, but drowning in a frozen lake, hunted by the very shadows David had tried to escape. The figure was upon me in seconds. There was no shout, no warning, just a swift, powerful hand clamping around my arm, locking onto my shoulder with enough pressure to bruise bone. I thrashed weakly, trying to find the leverage to fight, but it was like struggling against steel reinforced with ice. I was dragged backward, easily, toward the wreckage. I could see the faces of the other tactical operatives now. They were masked, wearing night vision goggles that glowed faintly green under the weak moonlight reflecting off the water. They were efficient, detached, and entirely uninterested in me as a survivor, only as an acquisition. I was hauled alongside the main body of the plane, near where the exit door had jammed open. The tactical operative holding me suddenly switched its grip, repositioning me so I was facing the submerged cabin. Through the jagged opening, I could see the cabin lights were almost completely out, but then a faint, flickering light emerged from the darkness of the aisle, a single, dying glow stick, perhaps activated during the initial chaos. It illuminated a small section of the floor near the galley, and in that weak, sickly green glow, I saw something else. Not David's body, which I assumed was still pinned in the doorway, but the woman, the supposed internal security agent, emerging from the shadows near the galley. She wasn't wearing the flight attendant uniform anymore. She was wearing dark, reinforced tactical gear, identical to the operatives who were currently holding me captive. She wasn't injured. She wasn't struggling. She was calmly retrieving something heavy from under a seat, the satellite phone Marcus had dropped, now miraculously retrieved. She met my eyes across the expanse of freezing water, and her expression was one of cold, professional disappointment. She hadn't been rescuing me. She had been managing the situation. She was the architect of the entire failed extraction, using Marcus and David as pawns to flush out information and test vulnerabilities. The operative holding me gave a sharp, nonverbal command to the agent by the door. She nodded once, then decisively ended the communication with Marcus Thorne. She raised the satellite phone, the phone that contained the evidence of who ordered the hit, and deliberately crushed it under her boot, ensuring no trace of the organized scheme's hierarchy remained traceable from the crash site. Then she looked straight at me, her gaze chillingly steady, and raised her other hand. In it, she held a syringe filled with a clear, viscous fluid. This wasn't about capture anymore. This was about permanent erasure. If David's death was unavoidable termination related to cooperation, my survival would be an unacceptable liability connecting the internal security operation to the crash. "Don't move," the agent commanded, her voice now clear, amplified by a small throat mic, cutting through the wind noise. "This will only hurt for a moment, Clara, and then you join David in the quiet." The operative holding me squeezed my arm tighter, preparing to drag me deeper into the water, ensuring I couldn't fight as the agent approached to inject me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the cold sting of the needle, the final curtain falling on my life under witness protection. But just as the agent took a step toward the water's edge, the rhythm of the rotor wash changed entirely. The methodical, measured thump, thump, thump of the stealth helicopter abruptly stopped. The engine noise sputtered, wavered violently, and then died completely with a terrifying, drawn-out metallic screech. The massive black machine, which had been hovering less than 20 feet above us, its spotlight bathing the crash site in an eerie, sudden illumination, began to fall. It wasn't a controlled descent, it was a plummet, accelerating toward the water with horrifying speed, directly toward the section of the fuselage where Marcus Thorne was still rigidly trapped. The tactical agent nearest me froze, her weapon half raised toward me, staring upward in disbelief at the massive, falling shadow that was about to obliterate the site. The air went silent one final time, save for the whistle of the descending aircraft. In that split second before impact, I saw the agent's face, the one who orchestrated everything, register pure, unadulterated panic. This wasn't her plan. This meant a rival faction, someone higher up, someone even more ruthless, had neutralized her cleanup crew before she could complete the job. The enormous multi-million-dollar stealth aircraft slammed into the lake, right beside the crippled airliner, sending a wave of dark water and pulverized metal washing over us. The resulting shockwave ripped my grip from the operative holding me, throwing me clear into the deeper, open water. I surfaced again, choking on the icy spray, blinded by the momentary flash of the impact light. When my vision cleared, the water was a churning, chaotic mess of foam, twisted metal, and oil slick. The tactical operatives, the agent with the syringe, Marcus Thorne, and the enormous helicopter, all of them were gone, swallowed by the churning abyss in less than 3 seconds, leaving only debris and the sound of my own frantic, lonely splashing. I was alone again, bobbing in the freezing darkness, surrounded by the evidence of a massacre orchestrated by a dozen different competing agencies, and I had absolutely no idea which side had won, or if survival meant I was now the most wanted person on the continent. The silence that followed the second, much larger impact was absolute, broken only by the crackle of spreading oil on the water's surface. The lake, which had been a frigid tomb for my husband and my past, was now a churning cauldron of wreckage from 2 aircraft, one of which had just been professionally annihilated. I drifted in the chaos, too numb from the cold and shock to panic effectively. My lungs burned, not just from the freezing air, but from the sheer, agonizing knowledge of David's sacrifice. He hadn't died because Marcus succeeded. He had died because he bought me time to witness her betrayal, the internal security agent who was supposed to be protecting us, but was actually running her own parallel, lethal operation. I felt a gentle current nudge me, not the violent pull of suction, but a slow, steady guidance. I opened my eyes again. I was being steered, carefully, by something beneath the water. It wasn't a rescue swimmer. The movements were too slow, too deliberate. It was David's body. Or rather, the weight of him, somehow held in place by the debris he had fallen against when he wrestled Marcus. The compromised exit door, still jammed half open, was acting as a partial barrier, but the sheer volume of wreckage from the fallen helicopter had shifted the currents, pinning his body against the opening, not fully pulled inside, but acting as a temporary, macabre anchor. I instinctively reached out, gripping the familiar fabric of his jacket sleeve that was still visible through the churning water. I didn't try to pull him free. I knew, instinctively, that his final act was meant to keep me tethered to the scene long enough for something to happen. As I held on, fighting the urge to sink with him, a new light cut through the darkness. Not the green tactical glow of the hunters, but a broad, sweeping beam of white, unmistakable searchlight. This light belonged to a vessel, a large one, cutting through the choppy waves toward the epicenter of the debris field. The sound was different, too. It was the deep, reliable thrum of a Coast Guard cutter, heavy and official. The internal chaos within the organized scheme, the double-crossing security agents, the hijacked pilot, the retaliatory strike that took down the stealth helicopter, had finally caused enough collateral damage to attract external, legitimate attention. A voice boomed over a powerful loudspeaker, cutting through the night air. "This is the Coast Guard. Identify yourselves. We have multiple aircraft signals registering distress. Maintain flotation devices." The voice was official, tired, and entirely neutral. It was the sound of the world snapping back into its normal, slow, bureaucratic rhythm after the midnight game of high-stakes assassination had ended. I let go of David's sleeve. I couldn't save him, but I could honor his sacrifice by surviving to tell the truth. Not just about Marcus Thorne, but about the corrupted faction of internal security that had used us both as bait. As the first rescue swimmer, a young man in a bright orange survival suit finally representing genuine aid, paddled toward me, I pushed myself away from the wreckage, kicking hard toward the approaching vessel. I reached the ladder of the cutter just as the Coast Guard officer pulled me over the rail. The warmth of the deck, the rough wool of the blanket they threw over my shoulders, felt like a return to a tangible reality. They were efficient, focused only on life preservation. They treated me as a survivor of a catastrophic aviation accident, exactly what the world was supposed to see. They didn't ask about Marcus Thorne or the paralysis device. They asked for my name. "Clara Vance," I gasped, my voice raw. The officer nodded, making a note on his pad, treating it as standard procedure. But as they ushered me toward the medical bay, a senior official, a man in a heavy navy jacket whose face was grim and professional, pulled me aside, away from the frantic activity of saving other scattered passengers. He didn't ask about hydraulics or engine failure. He looked straight into my eyes, the same cold, assessing look I had seen on the face of the internal security agent, but this time it was tempered with reluctant respect. "Ms. Vance," he said quietly, his voice low enough to avoid the ears of the responding emergency teams. "The two aircraft are registered to shell corporations linked to different elements of the network we've been tracking. We recovered the remains of the black helicopter. No identifying marks, wiped clean. We recovered one immobilized subject from the wreckage. That subject is Marcus Thorne." He paused, letting that sink in. Marcus was alive, but captured by this authority, the legitimate one that had waited for the internal power struggle to destroy itself. "You are the only civilian survivor who witnessed the internal breach. The agency that deployed that female operative, Agent Sterling, they're already being audited, Ms. Vance. They overstepped. They caused a public disaster trying to silence a liability." He leaned closer. "We are sweeping the scene now, pulling every bit of evidence, including the location of Mr. Miller's remains. We need to know what Thorne said to you, what Sterling said to you. The man you knew as David Miller, the real David Miller, He may have been a casualty of the program, but his final actions exposed a rot deep within the oversight mechanism. We can now guarantee your complete, absolute relocation, Clara. Not just a new name, but a new life, untraceable, safe, and compensated beyond measure. We owe him that. He looked out over the dark water where the wreckage of 2 secrets had just sunk. The life you knew is over. David ensured that. Tell me everything you remember about the facilitators Marcus mentioned. And then Clara Vance disappears for good. I looked back at the churning water, visualizing David's last breath, the sacrifice that finally broke the cycle. I had lost everything, but in losing it, I had gained the truth. I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, no longer contaminated by lies. It starts with the Vancouver subsidiary's offshore accounts, I said, my voice steady for the first time since the shuttering began. And I know exactly where the encrypted ledgers